The scent of lilies in the hall was so thick it felt visceral, almost sticky. It was the fragrance of a Hamptons funeral, skillfully disguised as an Upper East Side celebration. White petals, cold and flawless, framed our table, creating the illusion of a sanctuary, but to me, they smelled like decay. In the corner of the restaurant, a violinist was torturing his instrument. The thin, grating sound reminded me of a mosquito sinking its proboscis into skin before drawing blood. The candles burned steadily, but their light offered no warmth. It merely carved Mark's face out of the shadows. The too perfect Miami tan, the arrogant smirk of a self-made millionaire, the gaze of a complete stranger. I slowly turned the gift in my hands. A small box wrapped in cheap velvet. Inside was a gold-plated pendant. It shimmered with a vulgar, blinding brightness, like the smile of a Times Square con artist. I felt its true weight. It was too light, almost weightless. Yesterday, while Mark was in the shower, I found a transaction confirmation in his email. Cartier, Gold Panthère Collection, $45,000. A gift for Lisa. And this? I ran my thumb over the cold metal of the pendant. $80 at a duty-free shop in JFK Terminal 4. Mark had appraised 20 years of my life, my support, and my sacrificed ambitions at the price of a quick snack before a flight. My pulse remained perfectly steady, 64 beats per minute. I felt no resentment. Resentment is too live an emotion for what I was about to execute. What was happening now wasn't a dinner. It was a forensic autopsy. Quote, when his voice boomed, unceremoniously filling the space between us. He sounded like a poorly rehearsed anthem of a victor. Underscore, quote, underscore, to underscore, I whispered, my voice sliding across the table like a snake over the ice of the Hudson. Quote 3, I watched him take a sip of vintage Bollinger, but he was rushing. His fingers, adorned with a heavy signet ring, tapped impatiently on the tablecloth. It was starting. Mark leaned forward, adopting the air of a patronizingly sympathetic Wall Street predator. Quote 4, he said, his tone turning slick with counterfeit honesty. Quote 5, I didn't interrupt. I stared at his neck. There, just above the collar of his Tom Ford shirt, a vein was pulsing visibly. With every word he spoke, it twitched more violently. Tension was building in his body, though he tried his best to appear like a relaxed lion. He thought he was the hunter here. He hadn't realized that the only lion in this cage was him, and I was the one who had already locked the gate and thrown away the key. You've become too predictable, he continued, a spark of cruel pleasure flickering in his eyes. It's time for us to move in different directions. I've prepared the documents. Everything is fair. You'll get the townhouse in Greenwich, Connecticut, and a monthly allowance. It'll be more than enough for a quiet old age. Old age? I am 42. Lisa is 20 years younger. To him, it was simple mathematics of freshness. To me, it was the mathematics of his inevitable demise. Mark slid a crocodile skin folder toward me. Inside was a divorce settlement on his terms, drafted by the finest sharks on Park Avenue. He looked like a triumphant king of Manhattan. At 8:14 p.m., his phone, lying face up, flashed with a notification. I read the text without even tilting my head. The old bird took the bait. Wait for me with champagne. Yours, L. He quickly flipped the phone over, a faint, disgusted smirk playing on his lips. He expected me to cry, or to cause a vulgar scene, or to sign the papers, numb with grief. I didn't move. The air in the restaurant became dry and still, like a sealed tomb. I could physically feel a bead of sweat rolling down his temple, despite the powerful air conditioning. To him, my icy silence was a terrifying, incomprehensible noise. Quote 9, he frowned, losing patience. Quote 10, before we continue, please hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Thank you so much for your support. Slowly, almost tenderly, I pushed his documents aside. The sound of paper dragging against wood echoed like a gunshot in the absolute silence. From beneath my chair, I pulled out my own folder. Black, matte leather, no ostentation. Embossed on the cover were the words, "The truth about your new girlfriend." "Mark," my voice took on a steel, razor-sharp density, "the pendant is lovely, but this is your real gift for our 20th anniversary. Your new life, your lightness, your fresh air. Open page 5. You'll find the results of her last visit to a specialized clinic on 72nd Street and some interesting data regarding her bank transfers over the last 6 months. The clock is ticking, Mark. The first 7 minutes of your remaining 38 have already expired. Open it." Mark reached for the folder, and I saw his hand begin to tremble, just a ghost of a shake. He opened it, and his face instantly turned from a triumphant flush to a sickly, ashen gray. Page 5 wasn't just dirt. It was the beginning of the end for his financial empire, and Lisa was merely the first lever I had pulled to bring his Manhattan house of cards crashing down. Mark stared at the page, and I watched the light die in his eyes. The restaurant around us began to shift. At my almost imperceptible signal, the waiters stopped approaching our table. The other guests, like ghosts in a stage play, finished their meals and vanished into the shadows of the terrace. The light over our table narrowed, becoming the single, piercing beam of a surgical lamp. The air grew arid, sucking the moisture from his throat. In this silence, every sound became absolute. Quote 13. His voice had lost its thunder. Now it was the rasp of a man with a boot on his chest. I didn't answer. I was the one asking the questions now, even if they sounded like statements. My finger, cold and motionless, slid down the list of transactions. The rhythm of my speech became steady, like a metronome. March 14th, 11 a.m. A transfer from a shell account in Delaware, $50,000. May 12th, 3 p.m., $75,000. And finally, my favorite movement, account number 408, Cayman Islands, a deposit from September 28th. The exact sum, $412,800. I looked up. A large, oily bead of sweat was crawling down Mark's forehead. It snagged in his thick eyebrow before plunging onto the tablecloth. Dark, messy stains began to bloom on his $2,000 Tom Ford shirt. The fabric that was supposed to project status was now clinging to him shamefully. The scent of his expensive cologne, leather and sandalwood, mutated into the acrid, metallic stench of animal fear. These are just operating funds, Anna, he tried to squeeze out. His lower lip twitched betrayingly. You don't understand business. I understand mathematics, Mark, and I understand betrayal. You plan to use this money as a gold parachute for your new life, for your fresh air. The irony is, you're not the only one who can count. I turned the page. My movements were economical and precise. I pulled out a notarized transcript of text messages, screenshots from Lisa's phone. I read them aloud, punctuating every word. My voice was polite, almost tender, which only made it more lethal. Quote 18. Mark froze. His complexion shifted from brick red to an earthy gray. He began to gasp. The sound of his breathing was like a broken pump, wheezing, short thrusts of air. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned blue-white. His ego, his belief in his own irresistibility, his quote 19 everything, had just been gutted in front of its only witness. Quote 20, he whispered, staring into the void. Quote 21. Suddenly, a spark of rage ignited, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim control. He lunged forward, his face contorting into a mask of helpless malice. He tried to rip the folder from my hands. His fingers, used to signing million-dollar checks, clawed at the papers like a drowning man. I didn't flinch. My grip was iron. I wasn't just holding a folder. I was holding the balance of his collapsing world. Our hands touched for a fraction of a second, and I felt how hot and damp with sweat he was. My fingers remained icy. I looked him dead in the eye, and he saw not anger, but a bottomless, arctic indifference. His physical effort hit the wall of my will. A moment later, he slumped. His hand fell limply onto the table, knocking over a silver fork that hit the floor with a sharp ring. Underscore, quote, underscore, 22, underscore, I said, glancing at my watch. Quote 23. I leaned back, maintaining my flawless posture. The air between us was now electric with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. Quote 24, I continued, my voice dropping even lower, forcing him to strain to hear me. Quote 25. Mark lifted his head, his eyes widened with horror. Quote 26. He tried to shout, but only a dry, cracked cough escaped his throat. His world, built on lies and fake grandeur, was turning to dust to the accompaniment of that same violinist whose music now sounded like the final countdown on a scaffold. He looked at me and saw a stranger. The woman he had ignored for 20 years had just erased him from the earth in 8 minutes. A sudden gust of cold air burst into the hall, making the candle flames flicker wildly. The heavy oak door of the restaurant closed with a dull, final thud, cutting us off from the rest of New York. I slowly rose from the table. The sound of my stilettos on the lacquered parquet rang out like a series of dry gunshots. I began to circle Mark's chair in a wide arc, like a predator lazily closing in on a cornered beast. Mark sat motionless, but I could see his shoulders shaking under his fine wool jacket. The air was thick with the unmistakable smell of his fear, sharp with that metallic tang a victim tastes a second before the blow lands. Quote underscore 27, I said, stopping behind him. Underscore quote underscore 28 underscore. From the shadows at the far end of the hall, a tall figure materialized. The man walked with a heavy, measured stride. As he stepped into the circle of light above our table, Mark let out a sound like a muffled sob. He recognized him. It was Victor, my personal attorney and formerly a lead investigator for federal authorities, a man with eyes the color of frozen mercury. Quote 29. Victor's voice sounded like the grating of a steel bolt. Quote 30. Mark tried to speak, but his jaw simply hung slack. 10 years ago, he had bragged to me that he had, quote 31, with a persistent cop by buying his loyalty. He didn't know Victor hadn't taken the money. He didn't know Victor had become my most trusted ally the very day I realized what kind of monster I had married. Victor placed a heavy leather briefcase on the table. The lock clicked with mathematical precision.
Let's get to the procedural matters, Victor said officially, pulling out a stack of documents with government seals. Mark, I'm not here to discuss your adultery. That's your wife's department. I'm here to discuss your future, or rather, your lack thereof. Mark stared at Victor with an expression of absolute paralyzing shock. The wolf who thought he owned the forest suddenly discovered the forest was a fenced enclosure, and the ranger had already loaded his rifle. We'll start with federal crimes, Victor began to read, and every word fell on Mark's head like a hammer on an anvil. U.S. Code Title 26, Section 7201. Tax evasion on a massive scale. We have a complete evidentiary trail for your Greystone project, the gray concrete, Mark, using low-grade materials in municipal construction and inflating the invoices through shell companies in Delaware. I leaned close to Mark's ear, feeling the heat of a fever radiating from his skin. You remember those reports, don't you, dear? I whispered. The ones you signed after your third scotch without even looking at the specs? The damage to the federal budget, confirmed by our auditors, is $12,400,000. That's not just a fine, Mark. That's a one-way ticket to Danbury Federal Prison for the next 15 years. It's a lie, he managed, but his voice was thin as an old thread. You can't prove intent. Victor smiled coldly, and that smile was scarier than any scream. Intent? Mark, you provided all the evidence yourself this morning. I pulled the final document from my folder, the one I had slipped into his pile of papers right before he left the house. He had been so consumed by dreams of Lisa and his upcoming freedom that he didn't even notice that hidden among the travel insurance for our _quote_41_world cruise was a general power of attorney and acknowledgement of financial responsibility. Quote 42. Mark stared at his signature on the document. It was sweeping, confident, the signature of a man who thought he was invincible.
Now it looked like a death warrant he had signed himself. I said, walking toward the window. I turned to him, and in the lamplight, my face must have looked like the mask of an ancient goddess of vengeance. Quote 45. Mark let out a strange barking sound, half laugh, half sob. He clutched his head, digging his fingers into his perfectly styled hair. His world hadn't just collapsed. It had turned out to be a set in a cheap theater where he was the only audience member who didn't know the script. He rasped. I walked back to the table and looked down at him. 25 minutes since dinner began. The noose of the law had tightened around his neck so hard he could no longer breathe. But he didn't know the most important part yet. He didn't know about 2004. Outside the restaurant, the Manhattan sky finally split open. A crack of thunder rolled between the skyscrapers, making the panoramic glass vibrate. Rain lashed down suddenly and violently, heavy drops drumming against the window like a volley of bullets. It grew noticeably colder. I felt a strange aftertaste from the vents, a faint, barely perceptible scent of burning, as if something deep in the building's foundation was smoldering. Or was it memory itself that was burning? Mark's face turned the color of the earth. His skin, which half an hour ago glowed from expensive treatments, now looked like gray, damp rot. He looked at me, and his gaze drifted, losing focus, his features distorted like a reflection in a puddle under a gust of wind. He was hallucinating his own fall. "We aren't finished with the audit, Mark." I leaned in so close I could feel the feverish heat coming from his temples. My voice dropped to a whisper, insinuating and sharp as a razor blade. "There is one entry in your personal ledger that you marked as written off, but ashes have a way of turning into evidence if you know where to dig." I slowly extracted a thin, yellowed envelope from the depths of the folder. It smelled of a damp basement and old paper, the scent of a grave in the heart of a luxury restaurant. 2004, Mark. You remember that autumn, don't you? The construction site in Queens, the foundation of your first major project. You and your partner, Stephen Kovalev. You were like brothers. But Stephen was too honest. He wanted to report the safety violations in the concrete pouring. He was stopping you from becoming the man you are today. Mark jerked as if hit by an electric shock. His lips moved soundlessly, forming a name he hadn't spoken in 16 years. Quote 52. I continued, my words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Quote 53. I laid a piece of paper in front of him, the original forensic engineering report, with a blue seal untouched by flames, and several photographs clearly showing signs of a struggle on the edge of the floor, evidence that never made it into the official record. Quote 54. Thunder struck again, so close the glasses on the table chimed in protest. Mark stared at the photographs, his pupils dilating until they swallowed his irises. He looked like a man seeing a ghost that had come to collect its due. Underscore, quote underscore, 55 underscore. I straightened up, feeling an icy calm fill me with strength. Quote 56. I paused, savoring the way he desperately tried to connect the threads I had long since cut. Quote 57. At that moment, the restaurant door opened again. With a decisive stride, not hiding her triumph, Lisa walked into the hall. She was no longer the flighty girl from the cafe. She wore a sharp black suit, her hair pulled into a flawless knot. There wasn't a trace of the passion he had bought with diamonds in her eyes. There was only an Arctic chill. She approached the table, not deigning to give Mark even a glance. He tried to stand, but his legs seemed to have turned to water. He only gripped the edge of the tablecloth piteously, wrinkling the expensive fabric with his sweat-slicked fingers. His face melted in the flickering candlelight. His skin sagged, his eyes sank, turning into two black pits full of ash and decay. Lisa stepped right up to me. She pulled a heavy set of keys and a titanium-cased flash drive from her bag. The keys to his private safe in the penthouse, the final bastion where Mark kept dirt on politicians, and recordings that were supposed to guarantee his immunity. "Mom, we're done," her voice rang out in the dead silence of the restaurant like a tolling bell. Everything was in the safe, the second passports, the original Greystone ledgers, and the recordings of his conversations with Stephen the day before he died. He kept them as trophies. The word mom hit Mark harder than any of my legal accusations. He slowly turned his gaze from Lisa to me, and his eyes reflected a primal animal horror. In that moment, he finally deflated. His shoulders slumped, his spine seemingly breaking under the weight of decades lived in a lie. He became smaller, more insignificant, like old clothes tossed into a corner. "Mom," he rasped, and a scent of decay escaped his mouth, as if all the rot he had carried inside him had decided to come out. You knew, all this time." "I knew everything, Mark. From the moment I saw the concrete dust on your boots that night in September 2004, I knew why you cried in your sleep the first week after Stephen's funeral, and I knew why those tears so quickly turned into a thirst for power." I walked up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was ice cold. "You thought Lisa was your reward for success, your prize, but she was my project, my longest and most complex masterpiece. All these years, I didn't raise her as a daughter. I raised her as an instrument of vengeance. I fed her stories of what a great man her father was, knowing that when the time came, I would put a knife in her hand, and you walked right onto the blade." The thunder outside drowned out his groan. The rain beat against the glass so fiercely it felt as if the world outside was trying to burst in and wash away this filth along with the restaurant, Mark, and all his sins. The smell of burning became unbearable. It was his illusions on fire, turning into acrid smoke that filled his lungs. 33 minutes, Mark," I whispered, watching him slowly sink toward the floor. "Only 5 left. The final bill has already been printed." Lisa stood beside me, cold and beautiful in her unwavering hatred. She didn't look at him as a man or a lover. She looked at him like an insect that had crawled across a clean table for too long. This revenge wasn't just served cold. It was frozen to absolute zero. Mark closed his eyes, and a single tear crawled down his cheek, leaving a trail through the layer of gray sweat. It wasn't a tear of repentance, but of the realization of a total, irreversible collapse. He had lost not only his money and his freedom, he had lost reality itself. Quote 70. I said to Victor and Lisa, adjusting the collar of my flawless coat. Quote 71. Lightning flashed outside, turning the hall into a negative for a split second. Mark's white face against the backdrop of the black, roaring city. The shadow of the past had finally overtaken him, and in that shadow there was no room left for life, only for ash and decay. A dead, vacuum-like silence fell over the room. It felt as if time itself would stop if I dared to stop breathing, frozen in this point between triumph and catastrophe. I stood over Mark, looking at the crown of his head, where his hair had begun to thin, a detail he had hidden so carefully all these years. He was crushed in his chair like a broken doll thrown away as junk. Outside, through the veil of rain, the first flashes pierced the dark, blue and red, rhythmic, cold lights of police cars reflecting in the crystal glasses and silver utensils. The restaurant filled with a restless, pulsing light, turning our sanctuary into a crime scene. Quote 72. My voice sounded quiet, almost tender, but in this silence, it cut deeper than a scream. He slowly raised his head. In his eyes was a scorched desert. Quote 73. I continued. Quote 74. I paused, letting him grasp the magnitude of his own insignificance. Quote 75. In his pocket, his phone came to life, an insistent, sharp vibration. Mark didn't move. He stared at the screen, which displayed the number of his head of security. That's the police, Mark, I stated. They are at your office on Madison Avenue right now. They're opening your safe, the one Lisa just gave me the keys to. Your loyal guards are already giving statements to save their own skins. In this world, there is no loyalty that can't be bought. You taught me that yourself. I slowly put on my gloves, smoothing every wrinkle in the fine leather. Time seemed to slow down, turning every movement into a frame from an old noir film. 38 minutes, I said, looking at my watch. Dinner is over. I pulled a $100 bill from my purse and laid it neatly on the tablecloth, right on top of his useless gold-plated pendant. This is for my dinner. I'm not in the habit of leaving debts. For yours, for your dinner, the state will pay. For the next 15 to 20 years. I turned and walked toward the exit. The sound of my heels on the parquet was the only rhythm in that dead space. Just at the door, I heard a short, dry click.
The sound of handcuffs locking. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see the officers lifting him from the chair. I didn't need to see his shame. I had already struck him from the ledger of my life. The cold New York night air hit my face, washing away the cloying scent of lilies. A black limousine stood at the entrance. The driver opened the door. Inside, in the dimness of the cabin, sat Lisa. She was looking out the window at the flashing lights, her profile looking as if it were carved from ice. The car pulled away, seamlessly merging into the flow of traffic on Fifth Avenue. We drove in silence. Lisa turned to me, her eyes still holding a trace of expectation, perhaps for gratitude, or at least for warmth. I looked at her, and not a single string stirred inside me. Quote 81, I said dryly. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. The final thought, which I will never speak aloud, brought a faint, almost imperceptible smile to my lips. Lisa was never Kovalev's daughter. She isn't even from New York. She just looked enough like that old photograph from 2004, enough to make him believe. That was the last lie, Mark. A lie created solely so you would finally lose your mind in your cell, imagining who you had been sleeping with, so you would drown in your own paranoia. Lisa was nobody, just another tool, another figure in my icy calculation. And now that the account was settled, I no longer needed to remember her name. The car vanished into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving the ruins of Mark's empire far behind. 38 minutes. The debits matched the credits, an ideal balance. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this chilling audit. Anna proved that some debts are never truly forgotten. They are simply collected with interest. If you found this story of icy justice satisfying, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support my work. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and it means the world to me.